Welcome back, and as we earlier said, that this is going to be an exclusive interview that focuses over the historical ties between Egypt and India, the political, social, and on top of all, economic partnership between both nations, and the strong bond that tied both nations for years and years and since 1950s. Of course, as we all know, that President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi met with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi this week on a visit that focused on boosting and empowering the bond between Egypt and India, and also, as we all know, that both countries they share the deep relations since the 1950s that date back, of course, to memories of the non-aligned movement, which sought an alternative path to siding with communism or capitalism at the height of the Cold War. And Egypt has traditionally been one of India's most important trading partners in the African continent, and the India-Egypt bilateral trade agreement has been in operation since March 1978 and is based on the most favored nation clause. And we're very delighted to be having with us here live in the studio our dear guest, His Excellency, the Indian Ambassador to Egypt, His Excellency Ambassador Ajit Gupte. Good morning, Your Excellency.
Morning.
How are you doing, sir?
Fine, thank you.
Let us first talk about the weighing or assessing the strategic ties that bind the two countries. As we all know that His Excellency, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, stressed that India is keen on boosting and strengthening the bilateral ties between Egypt and India. So let us shed light on this historical relationships. How important are these ties? Excuse me.
Well, India and Egypt share a unique relationship. Firstly, both countries were two of the greatest ancient civilizations in the world. And our links go back more than 4,000 years ago. In fact, as our Prime Minister said in January this year, more than 4,000 years ago we found evidence of Egyptian artifacts in a port in the western state of Gujarat. So throughout the centuries our maritime links have continued. Indian traders are supposed to have brought things like koshiari and also mangoes to Egypt. In the 20th century, we had very good relations between Mahatma Gandhi and Saad Zaghloul, between President Nasser and Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and together we founded the non-aligned movement. So we have a very strong background and platform to our relations, which is very, very important. Now, in the decades since the 1960s, the relations have continued to strengthen. We've had a number of high-level visits, but since President Sisi and Prime Minister Modi came to power together in 2014, which is another coincidence, our relations have continued to improve. Now, particularly in the last 1 year after the COVID-19 pandemic, the relationship has acquired a fresh momentum. Last year, 3 of our senior ministers visited Egypt. In September, our defense minister came and we signed an MOU on defense cooperation. Then in October 2022, our external affairs minister came, and in November 2022, our minister for environment visited Egypt. And we invited President Sisi as the chief guest for our Republic Day parade in January 2023, an honor which has not been bestowed on any other Egyptian leader. And it is really very, very rare that within a short span of 6 months of President Sisi's visit, that there is a return visit by our Prime Minister.
Hopefully, inshallah. And also, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi have awarded Mr. Narendra Modi the Order of the Nile. Egypt is the highest test. This is highest state of honor medal that is supposed to be taken to any guest or someone who is really appreciated in Egypt. So what's your assessment and what's your intake of that, if you'd like to shed light also?
Yes. Well, this is the first time that an Indian leader or any other Indian has received the Order of the Nile, which is the most important and the highest award in Egypt. And this award was given in recognition of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's contribution to the deepening and strengthening of bilateral relations with Egypt. As you know, in January this year, both leaders decided to elevate our relationship to a strategic partnership, and this was finalized during the recent visit of our Prime Minister. So, this is a recognition of the contribution made by our Honorable Prime Minister, and it signifies the friendship between the two countries and the people.
Exactly. So, what do you think is the other important fields of economic cooperation between Egypt and India at this time and probably in the next 10 years?
Well, Egypt is one of India's most important trade and investment partners in Africa. Our trade was around 4.5 billion until 2020, but in 2021-22 our trade grew by 75% to reach a record high of $7.26 billion. $7.26 billion. India is among the largest trade partners of Egypt. It's about the fifth largest trade partner, and India's trade with Egypt, it's balanced. India exports almost as much as what Egypt exports to India. There is a good complementarity of goods. For instance, Egypt exports some crude oil which is processed in India and sent back. Egypt exports fertilizers which are very much needed in India, also some citrus fruits, and India exports things like machinery. Last year we also started exporting some wheat, which is very much needed in Egypt. So, there is a very good complementarity of the trade. In addition, Indian companies are among the largest investors in Egypt. We have invested more than $3.3 billion so far, and Indian companies contribute significantly to Egypt's exports, and they provide direct jobs to almost 40,000 people. Now, following President Sisi's visit to India in January 2023, there is a lot of interest among Indian companies to increase their investments in Egypt. I am happy to report that in the last 6 months alone, 4 Indian companies have signed MOUs to set up factories with a total investment of about $175 million. Last year, we also saw 3 of the leading Indian companies in renewable energy signing MOUs and agreements to invest up to 18 billion US dollars in developing green hydrogen. There are many other big Indian companies which are exploring opportunities in Egypt, and I am confident that in the years to come, Indian companies will invest large amounts in Egypt. We are also seeing more tie-ups in areas like higher education and IT and financial services, which will have multiple benefits for Egypt.
Of course, hopefully. So, it is well known that Egypt and India, they share historical relationships. They share on top of all cultural relationships and cultural backgrounds, and also social, and you kindly were talking about the economic part, but also the strategic partnership is very important. So, talking about the strategic partnership and boosting and emphasizing the strategic cooperation between Egypt and India, how important is it for peace and prosperity of the two nations?
Well, the relationship between India and Egypt is multifaceted. I just now mentioned how important our trade and investment ties and linkages are. In addition, we have had defense cooperation for many years. India and Egypt have together carried out many joint military exercises, they do training, etc. But in the last 2 years, nearly 30 Indian defense delegations have visited Egypt. For the first time ever, we have conducted exercises between the fighter aircrafts of both countries. We have held these 3 times in the last 2 years. We have also had nearly 15 visits of Indian naval ships when they transit through the Suez Canal. They stop by, they carry out some joint exercises. So, the defense cooperation is a strong pillar of the bilateral relations. We also have very similar views on counterterrorism. We have held recently a joint working group on counterterrorism. Very importantly, both India and Egypt have a common view on many of the global issues in the world, and both have agreed on the need to fight climate change, to address issues related to developing countries such as increasing debt, improving food and energy security, and to come together to reflect the voices of developing countries during the G20 presidency, which India is currently holding.
Mm. Going back to the economic partnership, you kindly elaborated over that type of strong bond and working very hard to achieve the economic development and economic reform on many fronts that would cope with the momentum. But focusing more over this economic partnership, both Egypt and India, they agreed on fostering cooperation in several domains in particular. It covered agriculture, higher education, chemicals, fertilizers, medication, and you kindly talked about IT. So if you like to elaborate in detail about this, because India is recognized widely in excellency in those particular fields.
Right. Well, you see, although the trade and investment between India and Egypt is quite extensive, some of the areas that you mentioned offer a lot of potential for further expansion. For instance, in agriculture, we know that Egypt needs to import a lot of commodities, particularly food grains. So, from last year, we have started exporting wheat. Perhaps this can continue. We are also the most important source of rice for Egypt. I am not sure if you know that. India is in a position to export many other agricultural products like lentils, butter, etc., sugar, etc. Fertilizers is another area of cooperation where Egypt can actually help to supply India's requirements, because you do produce a lot of fertilizer. In the area of IT, of course, India is recognized as a superpower, and the first Indian IT companies have entered Egypt. I think there is a lot of scope for further cooperation in IT and digitization. Finally, when you look at health, Indian companies like the Serum Institute are the largest provider of vaccines to Egypt, and they are stepping up their cooperation with Vaxera. So, as you can see, although we have achieved a lot, there is also a lot of scope for further cooperation in new areas, including renewable energy, where I mentioned that 3 Indian companies have shown a lot of interest in developing green hydrogen. So, let me say that India today is a leading power in many areas in the world, whether it is engineering, defense production, renewable energy, pharmaceuticals, etc. And these are areas where the people of Egypt and India can benefit a lot through stronger cooperation.
Right. We talked about the privileges that could be found, or the treasures that could be found in India. Where do you see, this is my question, I mean, this is out of the script. Where do you see potentials in Egypt? I mean, Egypt is also full of some very important potentials. Where do you, as a country that is recognized worldwide historically, and that has a culture that goes back in history to years and years, where do you see other potentials for the future with Egypt?
Well, one of the areas where I think we can, what we say is low hanging fruit, where things can be accomplished very quickly, is in tourism.
Of course.
And everybody in India has heard of Egypt. Even in school they have learnt of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Because of the visits of President Sisi and our Prime Minister just now, almost everybody in India has seen reports about Egypt. There is a lot of interest right now. So, if Egypt is to organize a tourism promotion campaign in India, I am sure a lot of Indian tourists would come to Egypt. And tourism, of course, not only brings the people closer together, but provides a lot of economic benefits. So, right now, last year about 100,000 Indians visited Egypt, but I can easily foresee that increasing 5 times. We have right now direct flights from Cairo to Mumbai. We are also expecting Egypt Air to start direct flights from Cairo to New Delhi, perhaps from August. I think there is a lot of cooperation possible in preservation of antiquities, exchange of ideas on building museums and developing them. And this was one of the issues where Prime Minister took a lot of interest, because both countries are among the most famous civilizations in the world. we have an unlimited amount of treasures, and these need to be preserved and showcased to the world. So, this is another area where we can learn from each other and collaborate.
Right, for sure. And what is the significance of assessing regular channels for exchanging experience, probably knowledge regarding successful experiences and initiatives between the two countries? And as you've seen here, probably you've been spending quite a lot of time here in Egypt, and Egypt is becoming like a second home to you, Your Excellency. But talking about the initiatives that had been launched here in Egypt lately in the past 7 years, and the other projects and all the modern advanced steps that has been taken to develop all over Egypt. If you like to talk about this also.
Right. Both India and Egypt are developing countries. Both have young populations, and the primary task of the government in both countries is to provide jobs to the young people and to provide remunerative employment. So, if you see, there is a lot of similarity in many of the schemes which have been implemented in Egypt and India. For instance, we have Digital India, where digital services have been provided to a lot of people in India. Egypt also has a campaign called, I think, Digital Egypt. Similarly, Egypt has a concept called Haya Karima, where basic services, housing, electricity is provided to the weaker sections of the people and in the rural areas. And this is very similar to many of the schemes in India that we have for rural electrification, housing, provision of water, etc. So, there are many other schemes in India where we have moved ahead, whether it is in life insurance for the poor people, opening of bank accounts, providing direct DBT, direct transfer to certain beneficiaries, and we are discussing with the Egyptian government how some of these schemes could be implemented in Egypt, so that Egypt can learn from India's experience.
Right. And of course, the mutual situation and the mutual historical background, the mutual probably size of population between India and Egypt would encourage both India and Egypt to share many other projects and social network programs also and initiatives.
That's right. I think there is growing realization in Egypt and in India that both countries need to look at each other, learn from each other's experiences in development and share best practices, and this would be to the benefit of the people of both countries.
We can talk about India and Egypt and not delve into the cultural background and the historical background. India is one of the richest countries and most popular and recognized worldwide with this rich cultural background, rich history, and you name it. Egypt is also the same thing, owns 1/3 of the world monuments and very rich cultural background and history and all that. How could two nations of that way together, what exactly could they think of doing together to be able to empower this particular bond and force between the two nations?
You rightly said that both India and Egypt have unlimited treasures coming from their ancient civilizations, and actually tourists visit India and Egypt to explore the ancient civilization. They come to India to explore our forts and fortresses, the temples and the mosques, the historic monuments which have been built for centuries. And as I said, this is an area where both countries can cooperate in the future, because Egypt has also done a wonderful job in not only restoring and preserving its ancient monuments, which go back 3,500 years to 4,000 years back, but also in building some very good museums. And I'm sure the new museum gem will be opening in a few months. India is also embarking on a similar project to build some very good museums, and we have discussed and are discussing how we can cooperate more closely between our tourism and archaeological sectors.
And also with modern cultural activities also, because you're pretty busy. I mean, India is pretty busy like Egypt with everyday cultural activities and very popular events.
Yes, of course, Bollywood is extremely popular in Egypt amongst all segments of society, whether it is the young or the middle aged or the old, the rich or the middle class or the poor. Everybody follows Bollywood very closely. And I'm glad to see that the interest in Bollywood has continued. People are still watching it on new channel, whether it is Netflix or on TV or OTT platforms.
That's true, very popular.
Yes, and similarly the Egyptians like Indian music, they like classical Indian dance, and very importantly yoga is now becoming very popular in Egypt.
And meditation.
Yes,
And aromatherapy.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
and cuisine.
Indian
and
food,
Indian
of course.
philosophy.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, you've influenced the world to a great extent.
So these are the areas that we will be focusing on, and I do hope that more Egyptians will visit India and explore the unlimited treasures that there are in India.
Going back to partnerships, and in particular the modern partnerships to cope with the vision of 2030 and the 17 goals of sustainable development. Let's talk also about what is India's view about the future and renewable energy, and especially that India and Egypt could maximize cooperation in new areas like these areas and in green hydrogen production. Is there a space for this type of partnership?
Yes. You see, Indian companies have already contributed to Egypt's solar power development. Some of our companies have set up 300 megawatts of solar power energy at Benban. We can do much more in the future. As Egypt develops both its solar and wind energy, Indian companies which are manufacturing solar panels and also wind turbines and blades are in a position to supply Egypt with these requirements. You are aware that India has developed a green hydrogen policy, and so has Egypt, and this is an area where there is a lot of scope for closer cooperation in the future. In fact, Indian companies will be manufacturing electrolyzers on a large scale, and I think Egypt would benefit a lot through closer cooperation with India.
Right, Your Excellency, at this note, would like to thank you so much coming over to the breakfast show. It's a great honor talking to Your Excellency. Our best regards to the Indian nation, and very happy to see you here, and hope to see you again in the breakfast show here in Nile TV. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Your Excellency. And I guess we're going to go to a short break and we'll come back to you, so stay with us.